520. 520.
If you have a Bible this morning, Exodus chapter 15, I invite you to turn over there. Exodus chapter 15. Earlier this year, a plane was on its way to Hawaii, and it was full of passengers. And you've probably been on flights and know that it's too hot for some people and it's too cold for other people. And so on this flight to Hawaii, which was going to be a pretty long flight from the Midwest, it's too cold for this guy. And so he gets the flight attendant's attention and flags her down. And when she comes over there, he says, "Hey, I'd like to get a blanket because it's cold on the flight." And she said, "Okay, that's fine. I'll get you a blanket. It's going to be $12. And the guy said, "Well, I'm not going to pay $12 for a blanket because your plane is too cold, and it's not my fault that your plane's too cold, so I just want the blanket." And so they got into it. And, you know, there's been some negative press lately this year about airlines and passengers and their dealings. And so this guy's getting upset. And he is upset with the flight attendant about having to pay $12 for a blanket on the way to Hawaii. And so he makes an in-flight phone call to their headquarters or something like that, reaches out to the airline. And other passengers heard her say, "I'm going to take somebody behind the woodshed for this." And it's all over a $12 blanket. And so this flight is headed from the Midwest to Hawaii. People are going on vacation. They're going to have the time of their lives. But that flight is diverted, and they make a stop in Los Angeles. And by the time they get back on the way to Hawaii, they're one passenger lighter. This guy is missing out on this Hawaiian vacation that he has probably looked forward to for a long time over a $12 blanket. And so the flight's lighter as it goes over to Hawaii on that day. He does get a flight over the next day, and I'm sure he doesn't cause a ruckus over a $12 blanket and miss another day of his Hawaiian vacation. Now, you and I, we can look at that and we can say that's a pretty extreme case, and it is. Because here's a guy who misses a day of his vacation to Hawaii over a fight about a $12 blanket. He isn't happy about something. He is grumbling about something, complaining about something. And in the grand scheme of things, you know, I'm all about saving a dollar too. I'd be okay, you know, wondering, hey, why have I got to pay for a blanket whenever your airplane is cold? You know, that seems a little absurd to me. But much as I want to save a dollar, I'm not going to miss out on this huge thing because of a $12 blanket. Extreme case, we can kind of point fingers and say, how foolish of that guy. He misses out on part of his vacation because of a $12 blanket. But maybe you and I have things just like a $12 blanket in our lives. And maybe they're small things that we kind of make a big deal out of, and we see them maybe as big things, and we're kind of sweating those things, and we're not happy about that stuff or that situation, what that person said or did, and so we start getting upset about it. And we just allow it to fester, and it grows, and it gets worse and worse and worse, and before long, this small thing in our lives has distracted us from some of the great and good things that God has given us. And so while we might not be missing a day of our Hawaiian vacation over a $12 blanket, what are we missing in life? What are the good things, the blessings that God has given us and just, you know, given right to us? And sometimes we don't look at them, we don't focus on those blessings because we're too caught up with what we think we've missed out on. Or we're too, you know, concerned about the things that are going on in our lives that we don't like, that we miss the things that are going so great that God has given us. And so instead of being thankful like we should be and grateful to God for what He's given us, we murmur, or we complain to one another, or we grumble about what is going on. It's not new to us. If you're in Exodus chapter 15, I want you to start seeing this series of you know, things that happen in the life of God's people. And a lot of times these things happen, and sure, they're difficulties and they're hardships, and they might cause Israel to wonder, how's this going to work out? Or how's God going to make this situation right? Or how are we going to come out of this better? Well, okay, you can wonder about it. They wondered about it. But it comes on the heels of God doing some of the greatest acts in history. For instance, in the first part of the book of Exodus, you've got God hearing the cries of His people in Egypt after they've been there so years. And they hear about those cries, and they hear about or God hears about those cries, and He raises up Moses and empowers Moses to go over there and to bring the people out of Egypt, deliver them, redeem them from the Egyptians. And so he goes in, they work the 10 plagues through Moses, and then Pharaoh says, get out of my country. And they go and they part the Red Sea, and people cross over on dry land. The Egyptians are swallowed up right behind them, and these are the people who witnessed it. This is the multitude of people in Exodus chapter 15 who saw the work of God, and they witnessed how God came to their rescue, and they were present as God delivered them through the Red Sea and made them walk over on dry land. And they get across, they sing this song of Moses, and everything is great because God has delivered them, and they get a few days out in the wilderness of Shur, verse 22, 3 days into the wilderness, and they found no water. No water's bad, and I get it. And you're wondering where your water's going to come from, because we know we can't last 3 days without water, and we don't know where water is now. So what are we going to do? In verse 23, they came to Marah. They could not drink the water because it was bitter, and it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, what shall we drink? Here are the people of God. And you know, if you take Exodus 15, 22 through 25 out of the Bible and just say, look at these people. God brought them to a place where there was no water, and they're concerned about, well, where are we going to get our water to drink? How are we going to sustain our lives? We're going to die here. Well, you might be able to say, well, that's a pretty valid complaint because they don't have any water, and they can't drink that water, and all these things are going bad. But if you take it out, yeah, you can see that. But if you put it right back in Exodus 15 and you see that these are the people of God, the very same God who just recently had turned the entire Nile River into blood, then you might be able to think, well, I think God can do something with water. Or if you just go a couple of pages back and you see Exodus 14 where God parted the Red Sea and allowed them to cross through while it was parted, then you might be able to think, well, maybe God can do some work with water. And so maybe in Exodus 15 you could see that, you know, this idea they've got that they're going to die here because they have no water, that's foolish because they're serving a God who's just worked miracles with water. They see the problem. They grumble, that's the Bible's language, they grumble about it because they forget what God has done. In Exodus 16, you have another account. This time, they've got stuff to drink and everything's okay, but they don't have any food to eat. And so again, they've got this great God that they're serving, and they're following his lead, and he's led them to this place. He just provided water for them in Exodus 15, and now they're saying, well, we don't have any food. And so along the way, God's going to provide them manna, bread of heaven. He's going to give them quail for them to eat. And so God is going to come to their rescue, but it's not before they complain and they grumble about what God is doing for them. You go to the next chapter, Exodus chapter 17, and you see again that now they're concerned about bitter water and they don't have anything they can drink. And by the way, same God that they're serving, who's turned water into blood, who's turned it back, who's parted the Red Sea, which is full of water, same God that just gave them water in Exodus chapter 15. And now they say, well, here we are without water again. And they grumble and they complain about what's going on. And that's foolish, right? We can look at that and we can kind of see that how short-sighted do they have to be serving this God who's delivered them and cared for them, providing for them, and now they're concerned about what they're going to get to drink and what they're going to eat and then what they're going to drink again. Fast forward a little bit. Go to Numbers chapter 14 with me. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chapter 14. This is still Israel, and they are not far, really, removed from the events of Exodus chapter 15, 16, 17, where grumble, get water, grumble, get food, grumble, get water again, right after God's delivered them and redeemed them. This time, they're complaining about something else. They got some misfortunes in their lives, and I get it. They're upset about things, but skip down to verse 26, Numbers 14, 26. Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron and said, how long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, that they grumble against me. Say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, that what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. And it gets graphic, but in verse 29, your dead bodies will fall in this wilderness, and of all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who've grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb and Joshua, the son of Nun. You see what happens here? You got people who are delivered by God, they're saved by God, redeemed by God, and they are grumbling from the outset. Exodus 15, Exodus 16, Exodus 17, Numbers 11, God sends down fire and burns some of the people up because of their grumbling. Numbers 14, he says, look, because you have grumbled against me and you have mumbled among yourselves, you've complained about what I'm giving you, because of all that, I know it's uncomfortable for us to think about, but God says, you're not going to go to the promised land. The whole reason that I brought you out of Egypt, because of your grumbling, your complaining, he says, I will not let you go into the promised land. God takes grumbling and unthankfulness and complaining seriously. Now, for what Jim Ballou read for us, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Turn back over there, and we'll kind of settle in on this one. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That's what Paul's talking about. Now, this is not something that Paul just wrote out of the blue, and the people had no idea what in the world was going on when he said these things. Paul wrote these messages to people who would understand what he's talking about, like in verse 7 when he says, don't be idolaters, about their forefathers. Don't be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. He says in verse 8, we must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did. 23,000 fell in a single day. He says, we must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. But he says in verse 11, now those things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of ages has come. So Exodus 15 and 16 and 17 and Numbers 11 and Numbers 14 and all the other places where the people of God grumbled and complained and whined about what God had given them, all those things, Paul says, look, those things are written down as an example so that we could learn from them. 1 Corinthians 10 is about 1,600 years past those events that we just read about at Exodus and in Numbers. And still, Paul is saying 1,600 years later, look at their example. Look at how they lived. Look at their mindset, their attitudes. God's blessing was right in front of them. And it was right behind them. And every morning it was all around them in the form of manna. But over and over and over again, they were missing his glory and his goodness and the blessings that God was giving in their lives. They're grumbling, they're complaining. Right in the face of God's blessing was bad enough. What made it worse is that they repeat it over and over and over again. We only looked at a few examples, but there are lots where the people of God, being blessed greatly by God, being redeemed and saved by God, grumble and complain in his face. It's sin, and it's always sin. And so when God heard these complaints, or when God heard the grumbling, the murmuring of his people, his anger is, of course, aroused. And we don't like to talk a whole lot about the anger of God, and we don't typically like to talk about the wrath of God, but there it is. You question the goodness of God, and it arouses his anger. You question the blessings of God that God's giving to us in our lives, and it does make him angry. And so when we complain, the problem is that we are probably complaining about the things that God has given us in our lives. And I know they might be difficult and they might be tough, but they might want us to start complaining. They might drive us to start grumbling about our situation in life. Why have I got this and they got that? How come they got it so much better than I've got it? Does God love them more? Does God hear my prayers? We grumble and we complain, and what we might be doing is grumbling and complaining about exactly what God has put in our lives to make us grow, to make us better, to teach us lessons about him, and to teach us lessons about ourselves. So Israel has this bad habit of forgetting their story. They have this bad habit of forgetting what God has done for them. They have this terrible habit of missing the blessings of God in their lives. And so they grumble and they complain in the face of it. And God takes that grumbling seriously. He takes our complaints and our grumbling seriously. And so do we, as Christians, who are part of a better covenant with God, who have a better Savior than they had, who have a better situation spiritually than they had. Do we, Christians, take grumbling seriously? Or do we see it maybe as just an acceptable sin? Do we take complaints as seriously as God takes them? Do we see it as a serious of a sin as God sees it? Or do we kind of tolerate it in our lives and tolerate it in the lives of other people? Be turning your Bibles over to Philippians chapter 2. And let's talk about maybe and ask ourselves this question. Is grumbling or complaining, is it maybe the most acceptable sin in the church? Now, nobody would say that it's always wrong to complain. I don't think anybody's going to say that. There are valid complaints. I don't think anybody would say that it's wrong to see that something needs to change. Some things do need to change. Some things would be better off if we could improve them. But I think we would all agree that grumbling about that stuff and talking about that stuff to somebody who's not really involved or doesn't really need to hear it, that's where the problem comes in. That's where the grumble or the complaints becomes a sin. A lot of times, maybe we get God's instruction about our complaints or about our grumbling all wrong. Members of the church, and as we are members of the church, we come and we worship God, and as we worship God, we always keep before us God's blessings. We keep before us the love of God, the grace of God, the mercy of God. We talk about that stuff. We talk about how God's been good to us. We talk about how God has saved us from our sins. We talk about how we're led by the Spirit. We talk about how Jesus gave his life for our sins. We talk about bearing the fruit of the Spirit. We talk about all these great blessings that come with Christianity. We talk about how it's such a better life than any other kind of life. We talk about how we get the opportunity and the blessing to serve a loving God. So whenever we, Christians, focus only on what we maybe miss in the face of everything that God's given us, I wonder how God thinks about that. Whenever we grumble or we complain because, well, things just aren't going how I like them, or I'm not getting my way, or my life is more difficult than the next guy, if I grumble and I complain about something like that in the face of all the blessings that God has given me, then I wonder how God feels about that. Grumbling, complaining, a whining spirit crushes the church. And I think sometimes we miss that. Well, I think we know that if in our homes, with our spouses or with our children, if we grumble or we complain all the time, we don't ever talk about the good things, we only talk about the negative, bad things, well, then our marriage is going to go south. Our kids are not going to want to talk to us. We know how that works in our homes. If we do that with our friends, if we just are always negative, who wants to be around that? If we are always talking about what's wrong, what's bad, what's evil with people around us, then it destroys our relationships. And so I guess I can see, and we can all see, that grumbling and complaining, it destroys families, it destroys homes and marriages, it destroys relationships and friendships. But I think we've got to see that it also crushes the church. It hurts the church when we just talk about negative stuff all the time. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to be concerned about things that go on. I'm not saying it's wrong for us to, have an interest in what's going on with our congregation. We should, and I'm glad that we do. I'm glad when people offer insights or inputs or give ideas about, hey, we've been doing it this way for a long time. I would think it would be a good thing if we did this in another way. Great. Love the input. You're concerned. People are concerned. I'm concerned. We're all concerned. But there are ways to handle our concerns that are not grumbling and complaining ways. I want to give you 3 things real quick before we get into Philippians chapter 2. 3 things that we can do to avoid being like the people of Israel who grumbled and complained their way into fire and grumbled and complained their way into missing out on the promised land. Number one is, look, if we are going to be concerned about things, then we should express our concerns at the right time. That's number one. I don't want to let it fester. And if you've got concerns, about me or what I'm doing in my life, I don't want you to let that fester either. Let's handle it pretty quickly. Do it at the right time. Second idea, do it at the right time, and also do it to the right person. Maybe we're all guilty at some point of talking about what somebody else is doing, not to that person, but to somebody else. And the Bible calls it gossip. And maybe we do that sometimes. We talk about situations to people who are not the answer or the problem in that situation. That's not the right person. That is not expressing our concerns in the right way and to the right person. In fact, that's doing exactly what gets Israel in trouble. That's grumbling and complaining. That's what we call gossip, and that's what we call sin. And so do it at the right time, as quickly as you can. Don't let it fester. Do it to the right person, not about them, to somebody else. And then third thing is do it with the right spirit. Every time we see the Bible's instructions on this, it's always with the intent to preserve the relationship, to reconcile people who are at odds with one another. Go and tell him his fault so that you can gain your brother, we read. It's always about restoring and reconciling a relationship. It's about us growing. It's about us connecting better to one another. And so, yes, you got concerns about me or about us or about the church or about whatever it is. That's great, because it shows that you care and it shows that you're concerned about what's going on. But to avoid what happened to Israel and to follow Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 10, 7 through 11, express those concerns in the right way to the right person at the right time. I hope you're over in Philippians chapter 2. Grumbling is an offense to God, and I don't believe it's something that we can tolerate in the church. I believe that we can do better than that, and I believe we must. We've got to do better than that. When we were living in Carterville a few years ago, I got this bad habit of spraying our yard probably way too much every year to get rid of weeds, try to prevent weeds from coming up. And so best I can figure out what happened on this time was I had sprayed something like Roundup in the yard or around the yard to kill the weeds so I didn't have to weed eat so much. And apparently, I left the Roundup in the tank of the sprayer, and I was going to spray something on the yard to kill the weeds but leave the grass. And so I had enough in the tank to spray about half the yard by the way it looked. And so I sprayed that, and then I went and refilled the tank and put some more stuff in to kill the weeds, not the grass. And then a few days later, I started to notice, man, half the yard's really looking good. But half the yard it's getting kind of brown. Maybe it gets more sunlight. Maybe it's just not getting as much water. There's a tree over there, and maybe it's just messing things up. And so a few days passed. Half the yard looks great. It's green. It's really growing. And the other side is just getting darker. It's getting deader. And before long, I guess I kind of figured out that I guess what I had in there was Roundup. And I sprayed half the yard with Roundup, and I sprayed the other half with something that I was supposed to spray it with. So lesson learned. And so we're talking about it. We got a half-dead yard over there on one side. And so what we decided is we'll just put in a big flower bed. And so that's what we did. Went and got a bunch of soil and built it up, put rocks around it, made it look really nice, and put in all these flowers in half our yard. It was a big flower bed. Took a lot of work, but there were no weeds, no grass there. It was just dead grass. Filled it in, put the flowers on. But before too long, even though we had killed it out and we had decided we were going to make this flower bed and we're just whatever, before long, weeds started growing up in the flower bed. I'm sure you've experienced that. And so you got to go out there and you got to spray them again or you got to pull them up. And so there's a lot of time spent weeding the flower bed. You have a garden maybe. We had a garden this year, and we planted all our plants and everything was growing great, but you got to go out there every couple of days. We did, and pull the weeds. And it's almost like, no matter how much you decide you're going to take care of this garden, you're always going to have to go out there and pull the weeds. Or no matter how much prep work you do for that flower bed, you're always going to have to go out there and pull that random weed out. And I was thinking about that along with this lesson this morning, and it's kind of the same. You've heard of tumbleweeds out west. They're blowing across in all the westerns. Well, I came up with this idea this morning about grumbleweeds, and I'm still not sure if I like it. but that's what I decided to put on the PowerPoint, so that's what we're going with. Grumbleweeds. In our lives, we try to get rid of the complaints, right? We try to get rid of the grumbling. We try to get rid of all that negative stuff in our lives, but it keeps coming back, just like weeds in a garden. And if it keeps coming back, you got weeds in your garden, you've got a choice to make. You can either say, well, I'm tired of fooling with it. I decided that one time I was going to have a garden. I cleared everything out and I planted the thing, and I'm just going to let it go. And I'm not going to go out there and pull the weeds anymore. You can decide that, and you might know already that if you do that, then the weeds are going to take over your garden, and you're not going to have much to eat. Or you can decide, hey, I planted this garden, and I got it going pretty well, but weeds keep coming up, and I'm going to go out there, and I'm going to start pulling these weeds out. I'm going to take care of that garden. Here's how the illustration fits. That's our life. We might decide right here and right now that I'm going to quit complaining so much. I'm going to be thankful for what God has done. I don't want to be like Israel of old. I don't want to, make God angry by complaining about my life in the face of all his blessings. But this week, something's going to happen. After you've decided I'm going to quit complaining, something's going to happen, and you might want to complain about it. Or you might want to use the Bible's language, you might want to grumble about whatever that is. And you might want to let it fester. And that grumble or that complaint, if you allow it to sit there and don't pull it out and don't weed it out of your life, well, then it's just going to make things worse and worse and worse. And so what we've got to do is pull those things out of our lives. It's a constant thing. It's not just a one-time decision that says, I'm done complaining, and then life is grand, because the car is going to break down, and the roof is going to leak. And somebody's going to say something that you don't appreciate about you or about your family. And then we've got decisions to make. Am I going to grumble and complain and let that fester in my life? Or am I going to just pull that complaint out? Well, of course, I think we all would say, I want to pull it out. I want to pull the weeds out of my life, and I don't want to have any grumble weeds. Paul tells us a little bit about how that might work out. If you look in Philippians chapter 2 with me, Paul writes this letter from a prison, if you didn't know that. He is imprisoned. He's the apostle to the Gentiles, and here he is stuck in a Roman jail and unable to get out and go do anything that he wants to be doing. And so he's writing these letters. But look at what he says in verse 14. He tells us to do all things without grumbling or disputing. Well, there's really not a way around that. Paul says, live your life, do all things without grumbling or disputing. And so that really doesn't leave any gray area for me to say, well, what about this? Or what about if they do that? Or what about if my life takes this turn? No, Paul said, look, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Pull the weeds out. Verse 15, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. And there's a goal. Why should I want to pull those weeds out and stop complaining so much and stop grumbling about things that are going on in my life? Because we can be blameless, children of God, to shine as lights in the world. And then he continues, verses 16 and 17, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain, even if I'm to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith. I'm glad and I rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. Now, here's Paul. All right, Paul is converted in Acts chapter 9. He becomes this great missionary for Christ. He goes out into all these different places and he shares the gospel. But he gets in trouble because somebody has fabricated an offense and they've stuck it on Paul. He let those Gentiles into the court of the temple. Well, Paul didn't do it. Paul's lied about. People don't like Paul because he's sharing the gospel and people are coming to faith in God and Satan's trying to stop it and Paul's not going to let them. But Paul's in jail. And what he wants to be doing, which is going out into all the world and sharing the gospel and making disciples of all nations, he can't do as well as he wants to because he is stuck in a Roman jail because somebody lied about him. And in that Roman cell, he says, hey, do all things without grumbling. And if anybody at that point maybe had a cause to grumble, it's got to be Paul, right? Do all things without grumbling, he says from a Roman jail. Do all things without disputing. Why, Paul? So that you can be lights to the world, so that you and I can be blameless before this crooked and perverse generation, and so that we can show them the love of Christ. Paul, from a Roman jail, doesn't murmur or grumble or complain. He says, you know what? Why don't you not grumble? Why don't you make the best of your situation? That's what Paul did in his situation, so that you can not be, or so that you can be blameless, and so that you can be a light in this perverse generation. How do you get there, Paul? Because he writes about how he's got this relationship with his Lord. He says, I'm glad and I can rejoice with you all, even in the middle of a Roman jail, because Paul's the guy who writes that he's been crucified with Christ. And it's not him that's living his life anymore, but it's Christ who lives in him. And so because it's Christ who lives in him, it's not Paul that's saying, well, I'm being hurt here, I'm being offended, I'm being lied about, people are mistreating me. Paul says, I'm rejoicing, because no matter what's happening to me, I know what's happened. Paul rejoices, and he can rejoice, in the middle of hardship and difficulties in life in a Roman jail. He can rejoice because he knows that he's been bought with the blood of Jesus. And who is he to complain about the situation that God has put him in? Who is he to forget about all the blessings that God has given in his life? And sure, there are difficulties, there are hardships, and there are tough times. But Paul realizes those things don't take away the blessings that God's given us. And so for you and me, yeah, we might have things to complain about. We might have things that we've been grumbling about. We might have things in our lives, people have said things, did things we don't like, and instead of talking to that person, we've been talking to other people about that person, and we probably realize that's not how we ought to live, and that's not the life of a Christian. Maybe it makes us forget about the blessings that God has given in our lives. We complain about having to pay the repair cost on the car, but does it make us forget that, hey, God's blessed us with a car for us to get around and take our families around and go to work and earn a living? We complain maybe about the hole in the roof, but we've got places to go, and we've got places to lay our heads, and we've got shelter when we need it. We complain about some things that maybe go on at church, and maybe there's some things we don't like and things we wish were better. But let's not make those concerns we've got. Now, let's express those in the right way to the right person at the right time, but let's not let those concerns that we've got take away our focus from the blessings that God's given us with this congregation, with the church. Let's not let it take our focus away from the God who's blessed us with all those things. Israel did just remove 3 days away from the parting of the Red Sea by the staff of Moses. And they're worried about, what are we going to drink? What are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? They're worried about, is God really fighting these battles for us? They're worried about, did God bring us out here to die in the wilderness? And they literally say, we were better off back there in Egypt because we had fires to sit around, we had pots of meat, and we had stuff to drink. Their problems had taken their focus off of God and put it on themselves. And it led to grumbling, it led to complaints. They had the choice to make. We can take those complaints, we can pull them out of our lives, and we can live our lives to the glory of God, or we can allow them to sit, to grow, and to fester. And I think you know what they did. And so that's not the question. The question is this morning, what am I going to do with those things? What are you going to do? Maybe you got things in your life that you've been grumbling to other people about, and you haven't gone to the one that you really should go to. Maybe you've been talking about a situation with somebody who's neither the answer or the problem. And maybe what you need to do is go to that person directly. That's the teaching of Scripture. Or maybe it's not really a person. Maybe there are just things going on in your life, and you've noticed your attitude has been one that's pretty negative. And you've been kind of downcast. And maybe the things going on in your life, you wonder, why is God doing this? Why is he not doing this? Why did he do it for them and he's not doing it for me? Why does he love them more? Why does he not hear my prayers? And you've had these thoughts, and maybe those thoughts have taken your mind away from all the blessings God has given you, and Satan's focused you on the things that you think you need and the things you think you want instead of what God has decided to give you. And so maybe this morning you want to make those situations right. Maybe it means sometime today, this week, you go to that person you've been grumbling about and you talk to them instead of about them. Maybe it means that you spend some time thinking about the blessings of God in your life and you count your blessings, name them one by one. Maybe it means that you decide that you're going to pull those weeds out of your life whenever they come up, and you're not going to let the complaints and the grumblings sit and grow and fester. You're going to deal with it in the right way at the right time with the right spirit. Maybe this morning what you need is to become a Christian, because admittedly none of this stuff makes sense if I'm not a child of God. Because if I'm not a child of God, I do have a lot of things to complain about. If I'm not a Christian, if I'm still living in my sins, then it's true. I do have a lot of things wrong in my life, and I need to make those things right. And so maybe this morning, what you want to do is become a Christian, to respond to the gospel, to be baptized into Christ, and have those sins washed away so that you can say with Paul, in the middle of tough, difficult, trying times, you can say with him, I'm glad. You can rejoice, knowing that no matter where you are or what you've got or what God has put in your path, you've got a relationship with him, and you've got an eternity to look to with him. This morning, if we can do anything to help you out, to assist you this morning in your walk with God, if we can pray for you in any kind of way, please come let us know while we stand and while we sing this song.
Hear the sweet voice of Jesus say, come unto me, I am the way. Hearken, loving, follow the way. Come, for he loves you so. Only a step, only a step. Come, for he bled for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified. Casting your heavy burden down, come to the cross, the world may frown. Yet you shall wear a glorious crown when he makes up his own. Only a step, only a step. I'm for he bled for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified. Open for you the pearly gates. Blood was for you. Now watch and wait. Terrible thought to cry too late. Jesus, I come to thee. Only a step, only a step. Come, for he bled for you and I. He's the same loving Savior yet. Jesus the crucified.
Piercy has an announcement.
Just want to take a minute of your time. As you know, this is the month of Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's coming up, and one of the things we do each year is get together some Thanksgiving baskets for some of our members here in the congregation. If you want to help contribute to that cause, give your money to one of the elders. And let's see, Andrew Piercy, John Callis, and Mark Crooks and I are working on this. And we plan to have this stuff ready to distribute on the 18th, which is a Saturday before Thanksgiving. And we'll get you more information about that as we get a little bit closer. But if you want to contribute to that cause, get your money to one of the elders, and we'll take care of that and get this going. Thank you.
For our guest visiting with us this morning, we want you to know that we are opportunity. We hope that you filled out a guest card, so we'll have a record of your attendance. Hope that you'll come back and worship with us again when you have opportunity. Also, lads to leaders, There'll be a short informational meeting for anyone interested in knowing more about Lads to Leaders in room 108 after the service this morning. Chris Curry